Sometimes, the person who changes your life is the one you almost walked past. Emily Carter had never believed in love at first sight. At 24, she believed in early alarms, double shifts, overdue bills, and the quiet comfort of routines that never asked too much from her heart. Every weekday morning began the same way. She left her small apartment just before 7, coffee warming her hands against the cool Boston air, headphones resting around her neck without any music playing. She preferred listening to the city waking up. The distant rumble of the subway. The soft chatter of strangers. The rhythmic footsteps of people chasing another ordinary day. There was something reassuring about knowing everyone seemed to be carrying invisible stories of their own. Emily often wondered if anyone ever noticed hers. She certainly never expected to become part of someone else's. That Thursday looked no different from the hundreds before it. Sunlight filtered through rows of maple trees lining Commonwealth Avenue, painting shifting patterns across the sidewalk. A light breeze carried the scent of roasted coffee beans from a neighborhood cafe as cyclists glided past and office workers hurried toward glass buildings that reflected the bright September sky. Emily adjusted the strap of her canvas bag and lowered her eyes, already rehearsing the meetings waiting for her. Then someone laughed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply genuine, the kind of laugh that made everything around it feel lighter. Emily looked up without thinking. Across the street stood a woman speaking with an elderly florist arranging fresh white lilies outside his shop. She wore a cream-colored sweater with the sleeves casually pushed to her elbows, dark jeans, and comfortable sneakers that suggested she valued long walks more than appearances. Her chestnut hair caught the morning sunlight, and her smile carried an effortless warmth that made strangers smile back without realizing why. The florist handed her a single daisy instead of the bouquet she had reached for, and she laughed again before accepting it with quiet gratitude. Emily couldn't explain why she kept watching. She had passed beautiful people before. She had admired confident people before. But there was something different about this woman. She didn't seem interested in being noticed. She simply made the world around her softer. Traffic began moving again. The crosswalk signal changed. People flowed between them like a river, and within seconds the woman disappeared into the crowd. Emily blinked, almost surprised by the strange emptiness that followed. She didn't know the woman's name. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't even know if they would ever meet. Yet for reasons she couldn't understand, the memory of that gentle smile stayed with her long after the morning had moved on, quietly settling somewhere deep inside her heart, where ordinary moments sometimes become the beginning of extraordinary stories. The next morning, Emily told herself it had only been a passing moment, the kind that disappeared as quickly as it arrived. She buried herself in emails, answered phone calls, attended meetings, and smiled politely whenever co-workers stopped by her desk. Still, every now and then, her thoughts drifted back to the woman holding a single white daisy beneath the September sun. It felt ridiculous. She had not even exchanged a single word with her. By lunchtime, Emily decided she needed fresh air. Instead of eating inside the office, she wandered toward a quiet neighborhood park a few blocks away. The leaves had only begun to change, painting the trees with hints of amber and gold while families occupied shaded benches and children laughed near the fountain. She found an empty seat overlooking a small duck pond, unwrapped her sandwich, and finally allowed herself to breathe. The city always seemed kinder from that little corner of Boston. As she watched the gentle ripples move across the water, another familiar laugh drifted through the air. Emily froze. Slowly, she turned her head. Less than 30 feet away stood the same woman. This time she was kneeling beside an elderly golden retriever, scratching behind its ears while its owner smiled with obvious affection. The dog wagged its tail so enthusiastically that its leash slipped from the owner's hand. The woman laughed again, steady and warm, before calmly clipping the leash back into place. Emily could not help smiling. She noticed the small details now. The way the woman listened without interrupting. The patient way she maintained eye contact. The quiet confidence that never demanded attention yet somehow gathered it effortlessly. A few minutes later, the elderly man thanked her before continuing his walk. The woman remained by the pond, watching a family of ducks glide through the afternoon light. Emily considered looking away. Instead, she stood, walked toward the nearby coffee cart, and ordered an iced latte she did not really want. While waiting, she glanced sideways and realized the woman was standing in line beside her. For a brief second, their eyes met. There was no dramatic pause. No music. Only a simple smile exchanged between two strangers sharing the same quiet afternoon. "Beautiful day," the woman said gently. Emily felt her heartbeat stumble before she answered with a small smile of her own. "It really is." Their drinks arrived almost together. The woman thanked the barista, wished Emily a wonderful afternoon, and walked away carrying her coffee with the same easy grace Emily remembered from the morning before. Emily watched until she disappeared beyond the maple trees once again. This time, however, she realized something had changed. She no longer hoped it had been coincidence. She found herself quietly wishing fate might be kind enough to let their paths cross one more time. Over the following week, Boston seemed determined to keep placing Charlotte Brooks in Emily Carter's path. It happened so naturally that Emily almost stopped questioning it. On Monday morning, she spotted Charlotte browsing the history section of a neighborhood bookstore, carefully returning a novel to its proper shelf after another customer had misplaced it. On Wednesday evening, she noticed her holding the door open for a young father struggling with a stroller outside a grocery store. On Friday afternoon, Charlotte was sitting alone near the harbor, sketching the skyline in a notebook while gulls drifted across the bright autumn sky. None of those moments lasted more than a few minutes, yet each one revealed another quiet piece of who she was. Charlotte never seemed to be in a hurry. She thanked cashiers by name if they wore a name tag. She smiled at children who waved at passing dogs. She always looked directly at people when they spoke, making even the briefest conversation feel important. Emily found herself watching from a respectful distance, not because she wanted to intrude, but because there was something deeply comforting about witnessing genuine kindness that expected nothing in return. One Saturday morning, Emily decided to visit the local farmers market instead of sleeping late. Colorful tents lined the sidewalks, overflowing with fresh apples, homemade bread, wildflowers, and jars of golden honey. Musicians played soft acoustic songs while neighbors greeted one another like old friends. Emily wandered slowly between the booths until she noticed Charlotte again, this time helping an elderly vendor gather apples that had rolled across the pavement after a wooden crate tipped over. Without hesitation, Charlotte knelt on the ground, laughing with the vendor as they filled the crate together. When the woman tried to hand her a small paper bag of apples as thanks, Charlotte accepted only one, insisting the rest should stay for customers. Emily could not stop smiling. Before she realized what she was doing, she walked over to the same fruit stand. The elderly vendor looked between them with bright, knowing eyes. "You two have excellent timing," she said warmly. Charlotte turned, her expression lighting up with gentle recognition. "We keep running into each other," she said with a quiet laugh. Emily laughed too, surprised by how easily the nervousness faded. "I was just thinking the same thing." For a brief moment, neither of them hurried to leave. They simply stood there beneath the crisp blue sky, surrounded by the scent of fresh apples and cinnamon bread, two strangers who were beginning to feel just a little less like strangers, while neither of them realized that the smallest conversations often become the first pages of the stories people remember for the rest of their lives. After that morning at the farmer's market, conversation no longer felt impossible. It arrived naturally, as though the city itself kept introducing them one quiet afternoon at a time. Emily and Charlotte began recognizing each other before either of them spoke. A familiar smile across the sidewalk. A gentle wave outside the bookstore. A cheerful greeting while waiting for coffee. None of it was planned, yet each encounter lingered longer than the last. Emily soon learned that Charlotte worked as an interior designer for a small firm downtown, creating spaces that made people feel welcome rather than impressed. Charlotte learned that Emily worked as a project coordinator, someone who preferred solving problems behind the scenes instead of standing in the spotlight. They laughed when they realized they both carried paper books instead of reading on tablets. They discovered they shared a love for old bookstores, rainy afternoons, and quiet cafes where conversations could last longer than the coffee. One crisp Sunday afternoon, they happened to arrive at the Boston Public Garden within minutes of each other. Charlotte held 2 cups of hot chocolate and smiled. I guessed you might choose this place on a day like today. Emily blinked, surprised before laughing softly. That is either remarkable intuition or a very lucky coincidence. Charlotte handed her one of the cups. Maybe a little of both. They wandered along the winding paths as orange and golden leaves drifted gently across the water. Swans glided peacefully beneath the small bridge while families strolled nearby, filling the park with the quiet rhythm of an ordinary weekend. Hours passed without either woman noticing. They spoke about childhood memories, favorite teachers, forgotten dreams, and the strange comfort of finding peace in simple routines. Emily found herself sharing stories she usually kept locked away, not because Charlotte asked difficult questions, but because she listened with complete attention. There was no judgment in her eyes, only kindness that invited honesty. Charlotte never interrupted. She simply smiled, nodded, and somehow made silence feel just as meaningful as words. As the afternoon faded into early evening, the air turned cooler. Emily wrapped both hands around the warm paper cup and realized something that caught her completely off guard. She felt lighter. The constant weight she carried through every ordinary day seemed to disappear whenever Charlotte walked beside her. It was not excitement. It was not confusion. It was something quieter and somehow deeper. For the first time in a very long while, Emily was no longer counting the hours until the day ended. Instead, as the first city lights shimmered across the pond and they reluctantly walked toward opposite sidewalks, she caught herself hoping tomorrow might bring another unexpected coincidence, because life had begun to feel brighter in the gentle company of a woman who never once tried to change her, yet somehow changed the way she saw the world. Autumn settled gently over Boston, bringing cooler mornings and earlier sunsets that painted the city in soft shades of gold and amber. For Emily, those weeks became measured less by calendars and meetings and more by unexpected conversations with Charlotte. Sometimes they met before work for coffee. Sometimes they wandered through bookstores without buying anything at all. Other evenings they simply walked along the Charles River, watching the reflections of the skyline ripple across the quiet water. Nothing about their time together felt rushed. Charlotte never tried to impress her with grand gestures or carefully chosen words. She simply showed up, listened, laughed, and somehow made every ordinary moment feel a little warmer. That quiet consistency began changing something inside Emily, and the realization frightened her more than she wanted to admit. One evening, after returning home, she placed her keys on the kitchen counter and caught herself smiling for no reason. Her phone rested beside her, and without thinking, she hoped it would light up with another message from Charlotte. Only seconds later, the screen glowed. It was a simple photograph of the sunset over the river with one short sentence beneath it. "I thought you would like this view." Emily smiled before she could stop herself. She replied with a picture of the small potted fern sitting by her apartment window, bathed in the last rays of daylight. Their conversation drifted effortlessly from favorite seasons to childhood memories, then to dreams they had quietly carried for years without telling many people. Hours passed unnoticed. When the conversation finally ended, Emily stared at the silent screen, her heart unexpectedly full. The feeling should have made her happy. Instead, uncertainty slowly crept into the quiet room. She had spent years building a life that felt predictable and safe. She knew how to protect herself from disappointment by keeping people at a comfortable distance. Charlotte had never asked her to lower those walls, yet somehow they were disappearing anyway. The thought unsettled her. The following morning, Emily deliberately left home earlier than usual and chose a different route to work, quietly convincing herself it was only to avoid construction near the subway station. Deep inside, she knew the real reason. She was afraid of how naturally Charlotte had become part of her thoughts. She was afraid of wanting someone this much before fully understanding what that feeling meant. As she walked through unfamiliar streets beneath a grey October sky, the city suddenly felt larger and strangely quieter than before. For the first time since their paths had crossed, Emily hoped she would not see Charlotte that morning. At the very same moment, another part of her heart wished with equal strength that she was wrong. 3 days passed without a single message. Emily told herself it was for the best. She buried every spare minute beneath work, stayed late at the office, and accepted projects she normally would have postponed. Whenever her phone vibrated, she reached for it almost automatically, only to find another work email or a reminder she had forgotten to dismiss. She convinced herself that silence was easier than uncertainty. Yet silence had a way of growing louder with each passing day. The familiar streets no longer felt the same. The bookstore windows she used to glance at now reflected only her hurried footsteps. The little coffee cart beside the park still served the same cinnamon lattes, but somehow they tasted different. Even the benches overlooking the duck pond seemed unusually empty beneath the fading October leaves. Emily realized she had never fallen in love with those places. She had fallen in love with the memories they quietly carried. One rainy evening, she found herself standing outside the neighborhood bookstore without remembering how she had gotten there. Warm yellow lights glowed through the large front windows while customers wandered between wooden shelves filled with well-loved novels. Emily stepped inside, breathing in the comforting scent of paper and fresh coffee from the small cafe in the corner. She wandered aimlessly until her eyes settled on a familiar hardcover resting on a display table. It was the same novel Charlotte had once recommended after discovering they both loved stories about ordinary people finding extraordinary hope. Emily reached for the book and gently opened the cover. A small handwritten card slipped onto the floor. She picked it up, assuming it belonged to the store, but instead found a simple message written in careful blue ink. Some stories find us only when we are ready to turn the next page. There was no signature, yet something about the handwriting made her pause. Before she could think any further, the elderly bookstore owner smiled from behind the counter. "Your friend asked me to leave that inside if you ever came looking for the book," he said kindly. Emily looked up in surprise. "Charlotte was here?" The man nodded. "A few days ago. She said she was traveling to New Hampshire for a design project and was not sure when she would be back. She hoped you would stop by someday." Emily lowered her eyes to the small card resting in her hands. For the first time, she understood that Charlotte had never walked away. She had simply given her the space she believed Emily needed. Standing quietly among shelves filled with thousands of stories, Emily finally admitted the truth she had been trying so hard to outrun. It was never Charlotte's presence that frightened her. It was the possibility of losing someone who had already begun to feel like home. The next morning, Emily packed a small overnight bag before she could give herself another reason to stay home. The bookstore owner had mentioned the name of the lakeside town where Charlotte's design project was taking place, and for the first time in years, Emily chose uncertainty over routine. The drive north took a little more than 2 hours. Trees dressed in brilliant shades of crimson and gold stretched along the highway while quiet towns appeared and disappeared beyond rolling hills. Emily barely noticed the scenery. Her hands rested firmly on the steering wheel, but her thoughts traveled much faster than the car. Every mile carried the same silent question. What if she was too late? Shortly after noon, she reached the small town and parked near the historic square. It felt peaceful in the way only small places could. Families wandered between local shops, neighbors greeted one another by name, and the scent of fresh bread drifted from a nearby bakery. Emily stepped onto the sidewalk, unsure where to begin. She quietly entered a cafe, hoping someone might recognize Charlotte's name. The young barista smiled immediately. "The designer working on the old lakeside inn?" Emily nodded with cautious hope. "She is there almost every afternoon." Emily thanked her and followed the narrow road leading toward the lake. As she approached the restored inn, she noticed workers planting flowers near the entrance while painters added the final touches to the front porch. Charlotte stood a short distance away, studying blueprints beneath the shade of a large maple tree. She looked exactly as Emily remembered, calm, focused, and completely unaware that someone had crossed 2 states of emotion just to see her again. Emily stopped walking. For one brief moment, fear returned. She considered turning around before Charlotte ever noticed her. Then Charlotte looked up. Their eyes met across the quiet courtyard. Surprise softened into the familiar gentle smile that Emily had carried in her memory for weeks. Charlotte folded the blueprints and slowly walked toward her. Neither woman spoke at first. The autumn breeze moved gently through the trees while golden leaves circled around them before settling quietly on the ground. Charlotte finally smiled with the same warmth that had first captured Emily's attention outside the flower shop. "I was beginning to wonder if our coincidences had finally run out," she said softly. Emily let out a nervous laugh, feeling every carefully built wall inside her disappear at once. She shook her head, meeting Charlotte's eyes without looking away this time. "This is not a coincidence," she said quietly. "I came because I realized there is one place I truly wanted to be." Charlotte did not answer immediately. She simply smiled, and in that peaceful silence, Emily understood that sometimes the bravest journey a person ever takes is only a few final steps toward someone who has been waiting with patience all along. Charlotte led Emily along a narrow wooden path that wound gently toward the edge of the lake. The afternoon sun rested low above the water, turning every ripple into liquid gold. A cool breeze carried the scent of pine trees and fallen leaves, while the distant calls of birds echoed across the quiet shoreline. Neither of them felt the need to fill every moment with conversation. Somehow, the silence between them had become its own language. They settled onto an old wooden bench overlooking the water. Charlotte wrapped both hands around a warm cup of coffee she had picked up from the inn before leaving, while Emily watched the reflections dancing across the surface of the lake. After several peaceful minutes, Charlotte spoke without looking away from the horizon. "When you stopped answering my messages, I thought you needed space. I wanted to respect that, even if it was difficult." Emily lowered her eyes. The honesty in Charlotte's voice carried no accusation, only quiet understanding. "I was afraid," Emily admitted softly. "Not of you. I was afraid of how much my life had begun to change. Every place reminded me of you. Every ordinary day felt brighter because I thought I might see you somewhere. I did not know what to do with that feeling." Charlotte smiled gently. "You did not have to figure it out alone." Emily felt tears gathering before she could stop them. They were not tears of sadness, but of relief after carrying uncertainty for far too long. She laughed quietly at herself and brushed them away with the back of her hand. "I drove all the way here because I realized something on that long road." Charlotte turned toward her, listening with the same patient attention that had first captured Emily's heart weeks earlier. Emily took a slow breath. "You are the dream I never want to lose." The words settled into the quiet afternoon without urgency or drama. They simply belonged there. Charlotte's eyes softened, and for a brief moment she seemed unable to speak. Then she reached forward and gently took Emily's hand. "I have been hoping you would discover that in your own time," she whispered. "Because I have felt the same way for longer than you know." Emily smiled through quiet tears as warmth replaced every fear she had carried. The lake shimmered beneath the fading sunlight, and the world around them continued exactly as it always had. Yet everything felt different. Not because either of them had changed who they were, but because they had finally stopped hiding the truth from themselves. In that peaceful autumn evening, surrounded by nothing more extraordinary than still water, golden leaves, and gentle light, two hearts found the courage to choose one another with honesty, patience, and hope. Several months later, winter quietly gave way to the first gentle signs of spring. The trees lining the streets of Boston were beginning to bloom again, filling familiar sidewalks with soft shades of green that seemed almost impossible after the long gray season. Life had settled into a rhythm neither Emily nor Charlotte had tried to force. Some mornings began with coffee before work. Some evenings ended with slow walks beside the Charles River. Other days were wonderfully ordinary, filled with grocery shopping, shared dinners, and quiet conversations that stretched long after sunset. Emily often smiled when she remembered how frightened she had once been of feelings she could not explain. Now those same feelings had become the calmest part of her life. She no longer searched every crowd hoping for another coincidence because she no longer had to. Charlotte was simply there, not as an unexpected visitor in her story, but as someone choosing to write each new chapter beside her. One Saturday morning, they returned to the neighborhood flower shop where everything had quietly begun. The elderly florist recognized them immediately and greeted them with the same warm smile Emily remembered from that unforgettable day months earlier. Without saying a word, he handed Charlotte a single white daisy before turning to Emily with a knowing smile. "Some flowers have a way of finding the right home," he said gently. Emily accepted the simple moment with quiet gratitude. They continued walking through the neighborhood until they reached the small park overlooking the duck pond. Families laughed nearby. Children chased birds across the grass. The fountain shimmered beneath the bright afternoon sun exactly as it had the first time Emily had unknowingly stepped toward a completely different future. Charlotte reached for Emily's hand, and this time Emily held it without hesitation. There was no fear left to outrun, no uncertainty demanding an answer, only the peaceful certainty that love did not always arrive with dramatic moments or impossible promises. Sometimes it arrived through familiar streets, shared silence, patient hearts, and the courage to remain open when life offered one more unexpected chance. Emily looked across the pond before turning toward Charlotte with the same gentle smile that had once captured her attention from across a crowded street. She realized the greatest changes rarely announced themselves when they first appeared. They arrived quietly, almost unnoticed, until one ordinary day they became impossible to imagine living without. And as they continued walking beneath the fresh spring leaves, side by side toward whatever tomorrow might bring, Emily understood that the most beautiful dreams are not the ones we chase the hardest. They are the ones we choose to protect every single day with kindness, honesty, patience, and love.